In this lesson, we'll learn how to write request specs using RSpec. Request specs are designed to drive behavior through the full stack, including Rails routing. Request specs are marked by type request. With request specs, you can specify a single request, specify multiple requests across multiple controllers, specify multiple requests across multiple sessions. There are higher-level tests that actually drive the browser, but we'll focus on request specs to specify the behavior of JSON API endpoints. We'll begin by running Rails new testing to generate a new Rails project. Then we'll add gem RSpec Rails to the development and test group of our gem file and run bundle install. We'll then install RSpec by running bundle exec Rails generate RSpec install, which will generate the RSpec files and directories. Open the spec helper file. This file contains the RSpec configuration. There's also another file at Rails helper, which has Rails specific config for RSpec. We can configure RSpec by uncommenting the large comment block in spechelper.rb. To uncomment the block, delete the line that starts with =begin and the line that starts with =end. This will activate all of the config that was commented out by default. We'll stick with the defaults here, but this section provides a lot of different options to configure RSpec's functionality. Different applications and teams will have configured RSpec differently and even added additional gems that modify RSpec's behavior. First, I'll create a request folder in my spec folder. Now, I'll create a file named create_notes_spec.rb. It's important that the spec file be named ending in spec. That's how RSpec knows to run it. This sets up the basic structure of the test that we'll be writing. Notice the type request setting passed to RSpec describe. This lets RSpec know that we're writing a request spec. This setting causes RSpec to add several helper methods to our test to make writing a request spec possible. These helpers include methods to make HTTP calls and capture the response, as well as matchers that make response expectations easier. Our plan is to test requests made to the API/v1 notes endpoint. We want to write specs to cover valid requests, which should be successful, but also the behavior of when an invalid request is made, which should result in a bad request HTTP status code. We'll start by writing our invalid request. I commented the separate lines with their purpose in the spec. Arrange, which is to set up your test data. Act, which is to perform the action. And assert, that's where we make expectations about the resulting state of the action. This is a common pattern that you'll see repeated over and over again in testing. It's also referred to as given, when, then. The interesting parts in this spec are post, response, and have HTTP status. The post method refers to the HTTP verb post. There are also get, delete, put, patch methods available for testing endpoints that respond to those verbs. We pass it a URL, which can be a string or a Rails URL helper, and in this case, a params option. The params option will act as the body of the request. The response object is a wrapper around the HTTP response of the endpoint. It has a status, headers, and body. We can use this object to make expectations on the result of our post call. Whenever you use one of the HTTP call helpers, you'll immediately have access to the response object after making the call. So you have to act before you can assert anything about the response. Finally, the have HTTP status matcher is made available in request specs to easily and clearly make expectations about the HTTP status code in the response. We're using 400 here, but we also could have used the symbol version, bad request. Next, we're going to write a similar spec for the valid request. In this request, we want to specify what we expect to be in the response body in addition to the status code. The response body in our API is a JSON string, so first we'll parse that and convert all the keys to symbols. This is a personal preference. We could leave them as strings. Now that we have a parsed response body, the response body variable, we can make expectations on that object. We are using the include matcher to specify that we expect the response body to include the provided hash, but not necessarily exactly match it. Our response might have other keys and values that we don't care about expecting, like a created at field, which has a dynamic date time and might not be important in this case to our API consumers. Modify this code to test both a valid and invalid post request to API/v1/nodes. You should use the arrange, act, assert model that was explored.